The voicemail wasn't meant for me. That's the part I keep coming back to, even now. My daughter-in-law, she didn't know I'd picked up my son's phone by mistake. We'd just gotten back from a fishing trip. Our phones were both sitting on the kitchen counter, and mine had died somewhere around mile marker 14 on Route 9. So I grabbed the first one I saw. Same black case, same cracked corner. I thought it was mine. The voicemail started playing through the speaker before I could stop it. Hey, babe. Last night was, I can't stop thinking about it. Call me when he leaves for work. I love you. A woman's voice. Not my daughter-in-law's voice. I set the phone down on the counter the same way I'd set down every tool I ever learned to use. Carefully, deliberately, like the thing might break if I wasn't patient with it. I'm 58 years old. I've been a machinist for 31 years. I know how to be precise when it counts. I walked outside and sat down on the porch steps. The sun was still coming up over the tree line. It was a Tuesday. I remember that because the garbage truck had already come down our street, and I could see the empty bins the neighbors hadn't brought in yet. Everything looked exactly the way it always looked. I sat there for a long time. My son, Alec, was still asleep upstairs in his old bedroom. He'd had maybe 4 beers the night before, nothing crazy, just the easy kind of tired that comes from a long day on the water and too much sun. He was 31 years old, worked in logistics for a distribution company outside of Harrisburg, and he'd been married to his wife, Renee. I had to stop myself. I can't use that name now without feeling the weight of it. I'll call her what she became to me after that morning. His wife. Just his wife. They'd been married 4 years. No kids yet, though they'd talked about it. I knew they'd talked about it because my son had told me. He was ready. He'd told me that at Christmas, standing in my kitchen holding a glass of eggnog he barely touched, saying he thought this was going to be the year. I went back inside and put a pot of coffee on. I did not listen to the voicemail again. I didn't need to. I'd heard every word of it on the first pass. That's the thing about being a machinist. You learn early that a measurement is a measurement. You don't remeasure hoping the number changes. When Alec came downstairs, I handed him his coffee and told him we needed to talk. He looked at me the way kids look at their fathers when they know something is wrong but they're hoping it isn't. That particular expression, I'd only ever seen it once before, when I had to tell him his mother had been diagnosed. He was 19 then. He'd had that same stillness in his face, like he was bracing. I told him I'd accidentally picked up his phone. I told him a voicemail had played. I told him word for word what I'd heard. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "Dad, it's not what it sounds like." I didn't argue. I just said, "Alec, I'm your father. You can tell me anything. But don't tell me it's not what it sounds like, because we both know what it sounds like." He set his mug down on the table. He put both hands flat on the wood, the way I've seen him do since he was a little boy when he was trying to hold himself together. He got that from me, I think, that need to have something solid under your hands when everything else is moving. He said, "It's been going on for about 7 months. I didn't say anything. She works in his office," he said. It doesn't matter who she is." "It matters," I said. "It's complicated," he said. I said, "No, it isn't." He looked up at me then. His eyes were red and I could tell he hadn't cried yet. This was the kind of red that comes before, not after. He said, "I was going to end it. I've been trying to end it." I said, 7 months is a long time to be trying." He put his face in his hands. I want to be honest about what happened inside me in that moment because I think people who've been through something like this deserve honesty. I wasn't angry at my son the way you might expect. I was gutted. Not for myself. For him. Because I knew what this was going to do to his life, and I knew that nothing I said in that kitchen was going to undo 7 months of decisions. I was also, if I'm being truthful, angry. Not yelling angry. The quiet kind. The kind that stays. "Does she know?" I asked. He shook his head. "Are you in love with this woman?" He didn't answer right away. That was its own answer. "Alec," I said. "I don't know," he said. "I don't know anything right now." I got up and refilled my coffee. I stood at the counter with my back to him for a minute. Outside the window, a cardinal landed on the feeder I'd put up 3 springs ago. My wife used to love cardinals. She passed 6 years back. Sometimes I think about what she would have said in moments like this. She would have known exactly the right words. I never did. I turned around and said, "You need to tell your wife." He looked up at me. "Before this gets bigger," I said. "Before someone else tells her. Before there's a reason you can't control." He nodded slowly. I said, "I'm not going to do it for you, and I'm not going to pretend I didn't hear what I heard. But this is your marriage, your decision. And if you want to have any chance of saving it or of walking away from it with any kind of dignity, she needs to hear it from you." He said, "I know." I said, "Do you?" He said, "Yes, Dad, I know." I drove home that afternoon. I didn't hear from him for 9 days. When he finally called, it was a Sunday evening, and I was sitting in my garage trying to finish a birdhouse I'd started in February and never gotten around to completing. My hands were covered in sawdust. I almost let it go to voicemail. I'm glad I didn't. He said, I told her. I said, how'd it go? He said, about how you'd expect. I could hear in his voice that he'd been crying recently. Not presently, but recently. That dried out quality. She wants to try to work through it, he said. She asked me to go to counseling. I said, what do you want? Long pause. I want to stop feeling like this, he said. I said, that's not the same answer. Another pause. I know, he said. I know it's not. I asked him if he'd ended it with the other woman. He said he had. He said it had been clean or as clean as those things can be. I didn't ask for details. I wasn't going to put either of us through that. I told him I was glad he'd told her. I told him that whatever they decided, I was going to support him, that I loved him, that I wasn't going anywhere. He said, I don't deserve that. I said, you're my son. That's not how it works. The trouble started about 3 weeks later. His wife's parents, her father Mitch, her mother Carolyn, they called me. Not Alec, me. I don't know if that was a strategy or if they were just following their instincts, but they called my personal number and asked if we could all sit down together. I agreed because I didn't see a reason not to. I figured it would be a conversation between two families trying to help two people they loved. I was wrong about that. We met at their house, a nice split level in the suburbs of Lancaster. They'd set out coffee and a fruit plate, the kind of spread you put out when you want a meeting to feel civil. Mitch was a retired school teacher. Carolyn worked part-time at a dentist's office. I'd met them twice before, at the wedding and at Christmas 3 years ago. Decent people. I'd always thought they were decent people. We sat down, and after about 2 minutes of careful pleasantries, Carolyn said, we just want Alec and our daughter to be okay. We think if everyone could agree to move forward, they could really have a good life together. I said I agreed. Mitch said, she loves him. She's willing to forgive him, but she's going to need everyone around them to support that. I said I understood. Then Carolyn said something that I've turned over in my mind many times since. She said, we just think it would help if Alec had a stronger support system. Someone telling him this marriage is worth fighting for. I said, I've told him that. She said, we were thinking more directly. Like, have you sat down with him and really told him that what he did was wrong and that he needs to commit? I looked at her for a moment. I said, yes. I've talked to my son. Mitch leaned forward then and said, we're not trying to be difficult. We're just saying he's going to need guidance. Real guidance. And frankly, Carolyn and I feel like if he'd had a stronger hand early on, this might not have happened. I set my coffee cup down. I want to be careful about what I say here because I'm not an unreasonable man. I understood what they were trying to do. They were scared. They wanted their daughter's marriage to work. I understood every single thing that was driving them to that table. But what Mitch had just said, that my son's affair was in some part a product of how I'd raised him, that landed somewhere very specific in me. I said, Mitch, I hear you, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend my son didn't do something wrong. He did something very wrong, and he knows it, and he's trying to deal with it. But I want to be clear. I raised my son to be honest. And the moment he got caught, the first thing I told him to do was tell his wife the truth, which he did. So I'm going to push back on the idea that this is a parenting failure. Mitch started to say something. I said, I'm not finished. He stopped. I said, I support my son and I support your daughter. I want them to be okay. If they can repair this marriage, I will be the first person in that corner. But I'm not going to sit here and accept the premise that the problem in this room is how I raised my boy. There was quiet for a moment. Carolyn said softly, we didn't mean it that way. I said, I think you did a little, and I think you're scared, and I understand that. But we're not going to help these two kids by pointing fingers at the wrong things. We finished the coffee. The fruit plate mostly went untouched. Driving home, I felt something I didn't expect. Not anger, exactly. More like a kind of clarity. Like I'd said what needed to be said and the words had landed where they were supposed to. The next few weeks were quiet. Alec and his wife started counseling. A woman in their area, someone their insurance covered. He told me it was hard. He told me there were sessions where they sat across from each other and couldn't look at each other. He told me there were also sessions where something cracked open a little. I didn't ask which kind happened more often. That wasn't for me to track. What I noticed was that my son was changing. Not in a dramatic way. In the way a man changes when he finally stops running from something. He called me more often, not with news, just to talk. We'd end up on the phone for 40 minutes talking about nothing. A movie he'd watched. A project I was finishing in the garage. His dog, who had apparently developed a strong opinion about the mailman. He was more present than he'd been in years, actually. That's the thing nobody tells you. Sometimes people have to get to the worst version of themselves before they find their way back. I'm not saying it was worth it. I'm saying I watched my son start to show up again. His wife, from what I could tell, was doing the harder work. She was the one who had to decide every single morning whether she was going to stay in it or not. That kind of daily decision, I have enormous respect for it. I've never been in her position. I can't fully know what that costs a person. About 2 months in, she called me herself. First time she'd ever called me directly. She said, "I just wanted you to know that I don't blame you for any of it." I said, "I appreciate that." She says, "Your son told me that you told him to tell me the truth right away." That meant something to me. I didn't know what to say to that. I said, "He's a good man who did a bad thing. I believe that's still true." She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "I'm trying to believe that too." I said, "You don't owe me anything. You don't owe him anything. Whatever you decide, I want you to know I think you're handling this with more grace than most people could." She cried a little. Not long. She pulled herself back together quickly. She's a strong person. I'd always known that about her. I just saw it more clearly in that phone call than I ever had before. Now here's the part that most people probably want to hear. About 3.5 months into the counseling, Alex's wife found out something that changed everything. I'm not going to get into every detail because some of it isn't mine to tell, but the short version is this. The woman Alec had been seeing, she had filed a complaint with HR at their company, claiming that the relationship had not been consensual on her end, that it had been coercive. My son called me at 11:30 at night when it happened. I could barely hear him over his own breathing. I said, "Tell me everything." He did. When he finished, I said, "Did it happen the way she's describing?" He said, "No, Dad, no. It was mutual. There are messages. There are months of messages." I said, "Okay, do you have an attorney?" He said, "Not yet." I said, "Get one tomorrow morning first thing." I want to say something here about what that night felt like because I think it matters. My son is not a perfect man. He made a serious mistake in his marriage. But I know my son. I have known him for 31 years, and sitting in my garage at 11:30 at night, listening to him fall apart on the phone, I had no doubt in my mind that he was telling me the truth. A father knows. He got an attorney the next morning. A good one, a woman out of York who specializes in employment law. She reviewed the messages, the timeline, the records. She made it very clear very quickly that the complaint would not hold. It didn't. The company investigated and closed the case within 6 weeks. My son kept his job. He kept his career. His wife, and this is the part that still moves me when I think about it, she stood by him. She didn't run when things got worse. She'd already decided in that counseling room what she believed about her husband. And when this happened, she didn't waver. I think that's when he really understood what he'd almost thrown away. Mitch and Carolyn reached out again a few months after the HR situation resolved. Mitch called me. He didn't make any preamble about it. He just said, "I think I owe you an apology." I said, "Go ahead," he said. "What I said that day about the way you raised him, that wasn't right. I was scared and I took it out in the wrong direction." I said, "I know." He said, "You pushed him to do the right thing. That matters?" I said, "Mitch, I'm not keeping score. We both wanted the same thing. We both wanted them to be okay." He said, "They might actually be." I said, "I think they might." There was a pause. He said, "You want to come by sometime? Carolyn makes a pretty good pot roast." I laughed. First genuine laugh I'd had about any of this. I said, "Yeah, all right, I'll come by." It's been 14 months since that Tuesday morning when the voicemail played through the wrong phone. My son and his wife are still in counseling, not because they're in crisis, but because they decided it was worth maintaining. They told me they've learned things about each other and about themselves that they don't think they would have found any other way. I don't know whether that's true or whether they just need it to be true right now. Either way, I'm not going to argue with the result. Last month, they told me they're expecting. She's due in November. A girl, they think, though they want to wait to confirm. I was standing in my kitchen when he told me. Same kitchen where I handed him his coffee that morning. Same counter where I set the phone down after the voicemail stopped. I said, "That's the best news I've heard in a long time." He said, "I know, Dad." I said, "You're going to be a good father." He didn't say anything for a second. Then he said, "I'm going to try." I said, "That's enough. That's always been enough." I finished that birdhouse, by the way. The one I started in February and left sitting in the garage for almost a year. I hung it out back near the tree line, and about 3 weeks later a pair of house wrens moved in. I sat on the porch one morning with my coffee and watched them going back and forth with nesting material. These small, busy, completely determined little birds carrying pieces of the world into something they were building. I thought about my son, about his wife, about the version of this story that could have ended so much differently. Some things you can fix, some things you can't. The work is in knowing which is which, and then having the patience to let the ones that can be fixed do exactly that, on their own time, in their own way, without your hands on them constantly. I've been a machinist for 31 years. I know what precision looks like, but I've been a father for longer. And fatherhood, I've learned, is mostly learning when to put the tools down.